Future Trends is brought to you by the Institute for Economics and Peace.
Welcome to the latest edition of Future Trends, the weekly briefing on the changing face of global politics, economics, development, social and conflict. Here's this week's headline stories. Israel's military finds professional failures in killings of Gaza medics. Moscow plans to use seized US-owned company to feed Russian army. China warns countries against striking trade deals with US at its expense. Gold hits new record over US-China trade war fears. And scientists find strongest evidence yet of life on distant planet. Now for the latest in politics. China warns countries against striking trade deals with US at its expense. China warned countries against striking a broader economic deal with the US at its expense, as the trade war between the world's two biggest economies escalates. Beijing will firmly oppose any party striking a deal at China's expense, and will take countermeasures in a resolute and reciprocal manner. Moscow plans to use seized US-owned company to feed Russian army. An American-owned company seized by the Kremlin has been placed under state control to be used to supply food to the Russian army, potentially threatening Moscow's warming relations with the US. Harvard University suing to stop funds freezing. The court action was in response to the US administration cutting $2.2 billion in federal funding and threatened the university's tax-exempt status. The feud escalated when the elite institution rejected a list of demands that the government said was designed to curb diversity initiatives and fight anti-Semitism at the school, including reporting students to the federal government who are hostile to American values. Lebanon arrests militants, asserting its authority. In a rare move against a cell that allegedly targeted Israel, Lebanese authorities said they arrested several people who launched rockets toward Israel last month, as the government tries to assert its authority and keep a fragile ceasefire alive. Lebanon had for decades been a country where militants led by Hezbollah held sway. But the state's power as an institution has been growing in the wake of a series of fierce Israeli intelligence operations, airstrikes and ground maneuvers last fall that wiped out Hezbollah's top leadership and devastated its ranks and arsenal. Ex-president of Peru sentenced to 15 years jail. Ollanta Humala was convicted of laundering $3 million in election campaign funds, while his wife, also sentenced to 15 years, and his son have been granted safe passage in Brazil. Lawyers say they will appeal. Turning to stories in conflict. Israel's military finds professional failures in killings of Gaza medics. A review into the killing of emergency responders in Gaza found there had been several professional failures, and that a commander would be dismissed over the incident. The 15 paramedics and other rescue workers were shot dead and buried in a shallow grave, where their bodies were found a week later by officials from the United Nations and the Palestinian Red Crescent. ISWAP claims responsibility for deadly attacks in Nigeria. The Islamic State West Africa province attacks targeted Nigerian security forces, as well as Christian civilians in Nigeria's northeastern regions. The attacks in Borno State targeted a Nigerian army barracks and pro-government militias, while in Adamawa State, the group claimed responsibility for 2 attacks on Banga village, a Christian community. Paramilitaries declare rival government in Sudan. The leader of the Rapid Support Forces, Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, said the group was building the only realistic future for Sudan, 2 years into a war that has become the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Fighting continues, with the army saying it had bombed RSF positions outside the city of El Fasher, forcing hundreds of thousands to flee the Zamzam refugee camp. Why attempts to reach ceasefire in Ukraine keep failing? Russia's Easter ceasefire in Ukraine lasted only 30 hours, with accusations of violations on both sides. One major factor hampering progress is the long history of broken ceasefire deals, resulting in deep mistrust between the two neighbours, dating back to Russia's 2014 invasion. By invading Ukraine in 2014, Russia violated the agreement on friendship, cooperation, and partnership between the two countries, signed in 1997. El Salvador proposes swapping US-deported Venezuelans for political prisoners. El Salvador President Bukele proposed sending 252 Venezuelans deported from the US and imprisoned in his country to Venezuela, in exchange for taking political prisoners held by Venezuela. Bukele asked that Venezuelan President Maduro hand over 252 political prisoners, while Venezuela's chief prosecutor Saab criticized Bukele's proposal and accused El Salvador of unlawfully detaining 252 Venezuelans. Now for news in economics. Gold hits new record over US-China trade war fears. Due to the China versus USA trade war, gold has jumped to a fresh high, having investors concerned. Spot gold reached a peak of $3,357 per ounce. It has risen by around a third since the start of the year, with the precious metal viewed as a safer asset for investors during times of economic uncertainty. Tariffs trigger US economic slowdown with 45% chance of recession. The US tariff policy will trigger a significant slowdown in the US economy this year and next, with the median probability of recession in the next 12 months approaching 50%, according to a poll of economists. However, the International Monetary Fund said, despite the tariff uncertainty, there will not be a global recession. Politics haven't deterred investors from South Africa. Investors have turned to South Africa's domestic bond markets, betting the country can stay the course on reforms despite political fractures. But tariff threats and the prospect of a global growth slowdown are casting a long shadow. Bhutan turns to green cryptocurrency to fuel economy. The Himalayan nation is exploring ways to mine and leverage green cryptocurrencies using hydropower to boost its economy and create jobs to reduce the loss of talent. Egypt's revenue from the Suez Canal fell sharply in 2024. Regional tensions and wars in the Middle East have impacted traffic through the key waterway, with Egypt's revenue from the canal falling by almost 2/3 last year. Here's the latest in development news. South Korea finds Made in Korea breaches intended to bypass US tariffs. South Korea has found increased attempts to disguise foreign products as Korean exports, primarily from China, to avoid US tariffs. The Korea Customs Service said it has found $21 million worth of violations related to country of origin from the first quarter, with US-bound shipments accounting for 97%. Huawei readies new AI chip for mass shipment. As China seeks alternative chips to those supplied by US firm Nvidia, Huawei Technologies will begin mass shipments of its advanced 910C artificial intelligence chip to Chinese customers. Chinese AI companies have been left searching for domestic alternatives to the H20, the primary AI chip that Nvidia had until recently been allowed to sell freely in the Chinese market. Radio wave weapon used to repel drones. The British Army successfully tested a radio wave weapon to knock out drone swarms, as militaries look for new ways to neutralise what has become one of the biggest threats on the modern battlefield. LG, Samsung sue Indian government over electronic waste pricing policy. The South Korean companies have sued India's government to quash a policy which increases payouts to electronic waste recyclers, joining other major companies in contesting the country's environmental rules, citing business impact. The lawsuits mark an escalation of a standoff involving foreign companies and Prime Minister Modi's government over its stance towards waste management practices. India is the third biggest e-waste generator behind China and the US. But the government says only 43% of the country's e-waste last year was recycled, and at least 80% of the sector comprises informal scrap dealers. DHL suspends high-value US deliveries over tariffs. DHL Express is suspending deliveries to US consumers worth more than $800 because of a significant increase in red tape at customs, following the introduction of the US government's new tariff regime. Previously, packages worth up to $2,500 could enter the US with minimal paperwork, but due to tighter customs checks that came into force alongside the tariffs earlier this month, the threshold has been lowered. Finally, news in social. Robots race alongside humans. 21 humanoid robots joined thousands of runners at China's Yizhuang Half Marathon, the first time these machines have raced alongside humans over a 21-kilometer course. The robots were accompanied by human trainers, some of whom had to physically support the machines during the race. The winning robot was Tiangong Ultra, from the Beijing Innovation Center of Human Robotics, with a time of 2 hours 40 minutes, while the human winner's time was 1 hour and 2 minutes. Scientists find strongest evidence yet of life on distant planet. New evidence has been discovered by scientists that another world orbiting another star could be home to life. A Cambridge team studying the atmosphere of a planet, called K218b, has detected signs of molecules which on Earth are only produced by simple organisms. This is the second, and more promising, time chemicals associated with life have been detected in the planet's atmosphere by NASA's James Webb Space Telescope. But more data is needed to confirm the results. Death of Pope Francis, 88. There was mourning across the Christian world for the energetic reformer who inspired devotion from Catholics, but riled traditionalists during a 12-year papacy. World leaders paid tribute to the Pope's moral and spiritual leadership. Focus also turns to his successor among cardinals to see who next will lead the world's 1.4 billion Catholics. Tech companies extract rare earths from hard drives. In a first-of-its-kind pilot, Western Digital, Microsoft, and other US companies recycled nearly 25,000 kilograms of decommissioned hard drives and server hardware. Using a new acid-free chemical method, the team extracted rare earth elements like neodymium, praseodymium, and dysprosium, as well as high-purity gold, copper, aluminum, and steel. The recycled materials are already feeding back into supply chains supporting electric vehicles, wind energy, and next-generation electronics. China launches world-first 10G broadband network in high-tech city. China has launched the first 10G broadband network in its futuristic megacity, Xiong'an. Huawei and China Unicom collaborated to deliver the service using 50G PON technology.
Future Trends is brought to you by the Institute for Economics and Peace.